Welcome to today's ARI Seminar. I am incredibly excited to welcome you today. I'm Fern Hames from the Arthur Rylah Institute. Thank you for jumping on today. We have two really special presenters. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional lands on which we are gathering from right across the country, I think, today to join you for our ARI Seminar. I am coming to you from Taungurung country. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders, traditional owners, past and present, and acknowledge any Aboriginal people who are in the audience with us today. Welcome. It's a great opportunity today. We have two researchers with us. The first one is Maddi Miller, who has joined us relatively recently as a new postdoc. Maddi's part of a collaborative arrangement, if you like, between us and Melbourne Uni, and she's exploring how do we effectively actually bring together different ways of knowing. This is it's an area of research and an area of thinking that I'm really excited about. I'm just thrilled that we have Maddi with us. She has deep research background and insights to bring to us, and I'm absolutely delighted that she's with us today to present a seminar. Afterwards, we've got Chris McCormack coming up. I'll introduce Chris when we've heard from Maddi. So that's it from me. Over to you, Maddi. Thank you so much. I'm going to mute and thank you.
Thanks, Fern. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. So I'm Maddi. I'm a Darug woman, so traditional owner of the Western Sydney Parramatta region, and I live and work on Wurundjeri Woiwurrung lands, and I pay my respects to their elders and their ancestors and their country that has kept me safe for most of my life. I'm a researcher at the University of Melbourne and work in partnership with ARI to look at Indigenous ecological knowledges. And I just thought that since this is a Meet the Researcher presentation, that I should introduce myself a little bit. So I grew up in a small mountain town of Kinglake West, and this is a photo of my backyard. So you can see that I grew up surrounded by nature, and that's influenced me greatly in my career. So as a kid and as a teenager, you know, when you're deciding what you want to do, I knew that I always wanted to work outside, and I wanted to work in a job that placed me on country, and a job that meant that I could work and learn about my culture and the cultures of other Indigenous peoples. As a small child, my brother and I spent many days in the bush, sort of shimmying through hollow logs and climbing up the biggest trees and just generally trying to get ourselves lost in the bush. And I kind of think now as an adult of all the snakes that we would have run past and disturbed, but we never got bit, so that's nice. In 2009, I was doing my final year of high school, and I was really excited to think about what that year would bring. And like many Victorians, I went into that year hopeful for the future, but obviously in 2009, the Black Saturday bushfires ravaged my community and many other communities across the state. These fires came fast and they swept through my town. But my family and I were lucky, and we escaped minutes before the fire reached our house. But every leaf and each blade of grass on this 110-acre property was gone. The green trees that you see here were bare and black. And I think for me that has influenced me and changed me in a lot of ways. And it's influenced the way in which I advocate for country and for cultural practice. And for all of us, it's shown really that what we're doing and how we manage country is not working. This photo was taken last year, and I think that you couldn't imagine that this was once, you know, completely devoid of any greenery, and it was just ash and black trees. So after that year, I went on to study archaeology at La Trobe University, and I did my very first archaeological survey in the Kinglake National Park. And so since then, my career as an archaeologist has taken me to many different places, working with many different communities. And for me, it's about communicating the importance of culture and cultural practices. I've studied and worked in many places all over the southeast of Australia and in Micronesia, but sort of primarily I've worked in Victoria, and have developed an expertise particularly in historic Aboriginal places and gold mining. And just quickly, I thought I would share some slides, some photos. So that's me graduating from the Masters of Professional Archaeology with my mum. That's me working at Pentridge Prison during a community open day with Wurundjeri on the Plenty River, drinking palm wine after a long day of field work in Micronesia. And then that's also me with a braided tree on Binjali country. I just wanted to highlight that there's a diversity of Aboriginal culture and Indigenous cultures across the world, from the braided tree to the stone tools. In 2019, I was the very first Indigenous representative to be on the Australian delegation of the committee at the UNESCO World Heritage Forum. Part of my role was to provide my expert advice as a heritage practitioner, an Indigenous person on World Heritage places from across the globe. You can see me there speaking on the floor of UNESCO, and I spoke about the importance that Indigenous people have in world history, and just sort of how our places are underrepresented and often our values are ignored. I also participated in the Indigenous Peoples Forum and learnt how, in the guise of protecting ecological values, Indigenous peoples are being dispossessed from their lands, they're being forcibly removed, and they're being kept from their sacred sites and hunting grounds. And that's also the mob from Gunditjmara, because this was also the year that Budjabim was added to the World Heritage List. I just thought quickly a few other professional highlights from me was being selected to be part of the Joan Kerner Emerging Women's Leadership Program, being the first Aboriginal chair of the DELP Indigenous Staff Network. I also was interviewed by Malala for her publication Assemble, which is aimed at inspiring girls to continue in their education. And when I got to sit down with her, we spoke about the importance of Aboriginal voices and perspectives in all levels of the curriculum, and particularly in advocacy. I've lectured across a number of universities, participated in countless panels, given keynote speeches. I've been profiled in Frankie magazine, Engineers Without Borders, and most recently, and I think the coolest one, was for the kids magazine K-Zone, which I remember my brother begging for every time we went to the store. But I think that it's really important that there are plentiful opportunities for Aboriginal people to be platformed, and every time an Aboriginal person gets to speak, I think that we're all better for it. Sort of as part of my sort of speaking and advocacy, I often hear adults lament that they don't learn about Aboriginal people and our cultures in schools, but I think that it's never too late to learn, and that there's just more and more opportunities to listen to Aboriginal people from all backgrounds and all walks of life. So we just had our very last meeting, but I was formerly the co-chair of the Indigenous Advisory Group and a member of the steering committee to the Clean Air and Urban Landscapes Hub of the National Environmental Science Program. And through those positions, I advocated for urban research in cities to centre cities as country. It has always been important to me in my work and in my advocacy to assert and frame cities as country. There is this belief that I feel that it permeates many aspects of decision making in cities, and that is that it is not country or that country in these places is so damaged that traditional owners no longer need a say in what happens here. In part, I do think that archaeology, my profession, has a part to play in the creation of this myth, in the establishment of this understanding of significant ground disturbance as a reason to believe that there is no worthy cultural heritage of a place. So when people are trying to understand if there is any Aboriginal cultural heritage, they could use the argument of significant ground disturbance to say that there is none, that a place can be so disturbed that it no longer contains an archaeological value, and therefore that means that it no longer contains cultural values and the cultural obligations of traditional owners to care for the place. However, our connectedness to place reaches beyond the physical, cultural, material, and our custodial responsibilities do not end where the concrete begins. And this is a story, and I've just sort of highlighted some of the more poignant parts, but I urge you all to read this story of the creation of Port Phillip Bay on Naarm by Aunty Caroline Briggs. So Boonwurrung elder Aunty Caroline Briggs describes the inundation of Naarm, which Port Phillip Bay, and the knowledge she holds contains within it scientific knowledge that tells of a great flood that inundated the bay. But not only does this hold ecological knowledge and scientific knowledge of the inundation of the bay, but the story holds within it moral and social importance. It is a warning of what can happen when we neglect country, when we take more than what we need, and when we are greedy with the resources given to us by our creators. To me, it sounds, very familiar. The neglect of country and the poor use of resources leads to an environmental disaster. This story tells of the reciprocal relationship we have with country. We care for each other. When we care for country, country cares for us. Importantly, it shows that everybody has a responsibility and obligations to care for country, including visitors who are welcome to the land so long as they do not hurt the land, the Bik in Boonwurrung language, or the children of Bunjil, the creator. And to me, really, that understanding that we all have obligations to care for country and to care for one another seems to be a great starting point for treaty discussion. And that story can be found on the Culture Victoria website. And I think it's, it's, especially if you live in Melbourne, it's something that we should all know. So to me, this story shows the immense value of Aboriginal cultures and Aboriginal perspectives in all aspects of research and decision making. Our knowledge systems do not seek to silo out any one aspect of country or of people, but tells us that our health, in both a spiritual and in a physical term, is tied to the health of country, and that the health of country is tied to the health of people. Our stories recall events that happened tens of thousands of years ago, but with an immediacy that connects you to the people as if they were your grandparents. So I spoke before about when I went to UNESCO and saw Budj Bim included on the World Heritage List, and I think that that's also a story that every Victorian should know. So the eruption of Budj Bim 30,000 years ago is an example of that sort of storytelling. That memory of that eruption exists within Gunditjmara people, and it is still something that is incredibly important, but it happened 30,000 years ago. So the impacts of climate change have been felt around the world, obviously, and our people hold knowledge of climatic change, and that eruption of Budj Bim is one of those. But in Micronesia, when I was working there, I met people who were refugees and were forced to leave their outer islands as seawater had intruded on their groundwater, and so they were climate refugees. And when I wasn't recording the archaeological sites there, I was helping a local ecologist record the salinity of taro agricultural sites, which is the staple food of Yapese people. Her work showed that lower lying taro was subjected to the increased water salinity, which altered the taro and was starting to make areas unsuitable for agriculture. In Australia, we have been witness to what happens when country is neglected. As Auntie Caroline told us, when we neglect country, we face a crisis. I witnessed that in Kinglake, and we witnessed this again last summer. This is an image that I stole from Facebook of the Wurundjeri Narrap Rangers conducting a cultural burn in Macedon. And cultural burning is one element of country care, and I think it's so wonderful to see it being brought back. In the deep time of Aboriginal care for place, the pause in cultural burning is relatively brief, but the impacts of that is devastating. And our culture tells us what happens when we stop caring for country in a way that it needs to be cared for. And it also tells us what happens when entire landscapes change. We adapt. Our ancestors have lived here through climatic change, bore witness to volcanoes and rising sea levels. They've adapted when inland lakes dried up and negotiated and shared resources. At Coranjack Aboriginal Station in Hillsville in the 1860s and 70s, Aboriginal people from all over the southeast adapted and grew award-winning crops. They created incredible crafts and tools to sell and were one of, if not the first, self-determination movement in Australia. Here we go. So this image is a tree on the banks of the Barker, the Darling River. And the tree is really incredible. It grows down, its limbs reach into the soil, and standing inside of it, you feel like you're in a palace, but you also feel that you're in an embrace. It feels that you are being held and protected by country. When I was standing underneath that tree, I wondered how much it had seen. In recent years, it has seen a lot of change and death and sadness along the Barker, but it would have also seen family and love and times of bounty. And I wondered who else had stood underneath these branches and felt that embrace. I thought about the future, and I hoped that the future of the river would be led by Barkindji, for whom this river is their lifeblood. The blueprint for healing country and their adaptation is there. It is embedded in our stories and the knowledge that has been passed down to us over tens of thousands of years. Our ancestors were scientists, so it's no wonder that we are still scientists. And our ancestors' careful observation over generations is still embedded in our dreamings, in our language, in our laws and belief, and it's still embedded in country. My hope for my role at ARI and the University of Melbourne is to highlight this knowledge and to bring together ways of knowing. There are still many barriers to Indigenous knowledge being valued in academia and in ecological practice. This includes underrepresentation of Indigenous people, particularly in senior leadership positions, and the poor uptake of non-Indigenous staff in incorporating or seeking out Indigenous knowledge, and the long history of exclusionary and racist scientific practice. But I hope that my voice can in some way reach across the divide of Western science and Indigenous knowledge and open up conversations that help to change practice and work towards self-determination for traditional owner groups and the self-determination of country. So I might leave that there. Yeah, that's me.
Maddi, thank you. I just wish that you were doing this talk live, because then you would be able to see the faces of all the people who have just heard you speak, because I know that I feel really privileged and moved by the opportunity to hear you speak today. So big brava, and thank you so much for speaking. That was powerful, insightful, and I'm just so delighted that we have the opportunity to hear from you, learn from you, and work with you into the future. It's a really important step for us and for culture and for country. And I really note that, you know, everybody does have a responsibility and obligations to care for country and for one another. And I'm really excited for the future ahead. I just keep looking at that tree, Maddi, because when you put it up, the first word that occurred to me before you used it, the word that occurred to me was embrace. It really looks like an embrace. It's a quite magnificent tree, isn't it? That's extraordinary. Okay, well, let's leave it there and let people think about that. Thank you again, Maddi. Just can't wait to spend time and work with you on this for country and for people. It's just terrific, and it has been a pause in the way that people understand and recognise what country is, but I think science and community and culture are all re-emerging from that pause, and we can all be hopeful for the future. It's a great shift.
Thanks, Ben.
Well, now I'd like to, and I did note that, Maddi, you told a story in a beautiful way through imagery in your talk, and now we're going to jump to Chris McCormack, who is also a master storyteller in the use of imagery and all kinds of other things. Very keen on storytelling and how we connect people with nature and all those sorts of things. We know Chris through Remember the Wild. We know Chris through the People and Nature Alliance, and Chris is now also doing his PhD at University of Melbourne as well, and we work with him in a range of different ways. So welcome, Chris. We're going to switch slides over to the motivation we need, how good stories can save species. Thanks so much, Chris. Over to you.
Thanks, Fern. Hopefully you can hear me and you can see what needs to be seen and all the rest of it. And thanks so much to Maddi. That was an amazing talk. I was really enwrapped by that. And Fern, I think, as you just said, I'm talking about story now. I'm talking about nature, and it has to be said that when we're talking about storytelling and the preservation of the environment, there's a heck of a lot that we can learn from First Nations people here and around the world. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm streaming today from the lands of the Dja Dja Wurrung people and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And also I'd like to acknowledge that I myself am of Northern European descent, and everything I'm talking about today really is heavily influenced from a Western perspective, and it's just one way of thinking of things and discussing these issues. So acknowledging that there's many other ways of knowing. So the motivation we need, how good stories can save species, ambitious subtitle. First of all, we have a problem. We have many problems around the world, and I don't want to go on about this because I think this audience is well aware that we're facing a lot of issues today with regards to the health of our environment. So I won't focus too much on that, but this is, of course, the dramatic question, if you will, that has triggered a lot of the work that I do and that our team at Remember the Wild do. And from our perspective, we particularly look at things from this framework known as the Extinction of Experience. So we're talking about species today and saving species, and we talk a lot about the extinction of species or the collapse of ecosystems and things like that. But in the 1990s, an American naturalist named Robert Pyle coined the term the Extinction of Experience. And he grew up on the outskirts of Denver, Colorado, and he noticed that the time from when he was a child, growing up along the Highline Canal, which was basically a stream, an artificial stream that existed on the outskirts of Denver, that stream had become more and more developed. And people of younger generations were exposed to a lot less nature over time. And he referred to this change in the way people experience nature, the way people are able to interact with nature, as the extinction of experience. And since then, other scholars have taken this idea and sort of developed it further. So, for example, Soger and Gaston from the UK, this is their framework. They talk about two causes for the extinction of experience, and that is the loss of opportunity to interact with the natural world, and related to that, the loss of orientation, the loss of interest, the loss of desire to interact with nature, which is the extinction of experience. From that, we have these consequences. We have emotional changes in people with regards to nature. We have health and well-being changes, and after last year, I think that's really palpable for people after COVID lockdown, when people were not able to get outside, when they weren't able to access green space. I think people felt that really quite heavily. Attitudinal changes, and of course related to all of that, behavioural changes. And this results in a feedback loop, or what Pyle called a cycle of loss and disaffection. If we talk about those behavioural changes for a moment, if we are less connected with nature, if we have less of an affinity for nature, less emotional investment in nature, then we'll do less to look after it. If we do less to look after it, there will be less nature to go around. We will lose the opportunity to develop those emotional relationships. Therefore, the cycle continues. And I think Maddi said it pretty well when she referenced Auntie Carolyn Briggs, who said that when we neglect country, we face a crisis. We're saying the same thing here. When we forget and when we leave it alone, the cycle continues. So scientists in the empirical social science have come up with a whole bunch of ways of measuring this. And it's not on here, but I should reference that SOHA have DELP, so have ARI recently, very useful scale for doing the same thing, and basically trying to understand people's relationship with nature. And the reason this is interesting to us is because we now have several studies and several meta-analyses that demonstrate a relationship between connection with nature, or here I've written human nature connection, and pro-environmental behaviour. So that link that I was just discussing, it's not a one-to-one relationship, but it's quite significant, and it's crucial if you think over a person's lifetime how many decisions they might make in favour of the environment or against. The stronger affinity they might have for nature, the more likely they are to do the right thing. For Remember the Wild, that's really our focus, nature connection, and our approach is very much geared around storytelling. Different ways of telling stories, different ways of evaluating and learning about how storytelling can make a difference. And I think why we focus on that so much is very much captured by this quote: "Story is for a human as water is for a fish, all encompassing and not quite palpable." And that's by Jonathan Gottschall. He's a literary scholar who focuses on literature and human evolution, which is a pretty interesting field of study. Stories everywhere today. Many of us may no longer live in areas where we are able to interact with nature in the same way that people did 50 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago. But story is increasingly ubiquitous in terms of our lives, in terms of society, be it online, in the digital space, be it in terms of events, hopefully in person these days. Stories everywhere. So acknowledging that story as an experience, and the experience of story is only growing, only increasing, but the experiences of nature may be declining. We're using story to bridge that gap. So how do we do that? Well, and why would we do that? Well, narrative, the field of narrative persuasion, has revealed that story can be a very potent way of getting people to change their attitudes and behaviours. It's been demonstrated in healthcare, getting people to quit smoking, for example. It's been demonstrated in fighting prejudice and discrimination. And no surprise, it's been demonstrated in the marketing world. It's probably where it's been demonstrated more than anywhere. It drives sales. But it might surprise you, certainly surprised me when I began my research in this field. there's actually very little evidence, empirical evidence, showing how and through what mechanisms narrative might persuade people to care for nature and do the right thing for the environment. Which is surprising when you consider how many stories there are of nature. Nature is undoubtedly the oldest subject of storytelling and our relationship with it. Stories in documentary format, my octopus teacher there in the corner that won an Oscar recently. Stories of non-fiction, stories of fiction, stories in film, stories in podcasts and radio, stories everywhere about the environment. And yet we have very little empirical evidence about their effectiveness. As a part of my PhD research is with Professor Catherine Williams and Dr. Jen Martin, and we've developed this framework for how we believe environmental storytelling may influence human-nature connection and pro-environmental behaviour, and acknowledging, of course, the link between those two. And there's three broad pathways to this framework. The first is reduced resistance to persuasion. That narratives work in such a way as to reduce how people perceive that information, how people react to that information, and therefore increase the likelihood of persuasion. Interactions with people's identity. And this notion of meaningful media experiences. And I'll talk through these briefly now. Reduce resistance to environmental messages. Resistance in this case, we're talking about a motivated response triggered by the perceived persuasive attempt of another. And nobody likes to be manipulated. Nobody likes to feel like someone else is trying to get them to do what they want, particularly if you don't agree with their message, if you don't agree with their values. And so this often it can result in anger. Emotions like anger can result in counter-arguing, debating the points that they're providing, or just dismissing those points entirely. Narrative is believed to be particularly effective at negating this, and part of that is through what's called Diectic Shift. Diectic Shift, and I'll explain this as simply as I can. In everyday life, we experience the world in reference to ourselves. We experience location, date, time in reference to ourselves, our place in space and time, and our own motivations and goals. This is known as the Diectic Center. When we read a story or watch a story or listen to a story, we begin to experience the world in reference to the characters in that story. We experience their motivations and goals. We experience space and time in reference to them. This is the Diectic Shift, and a key mechanism of Diectic Shift in storytelling is known as transportation, which has been described as an integrative melding of attention, imagery, and feelings. And you'll know you've been transported into a story before someone might have walked in on you and you're watching a show. You feel utterly absorbed in it, and someone's trying to get your attention and they can't, because it actually does entail a loss of sensory connection to reality. It's like you're literally been transported somewhere. So this Diectic Shift, this immersion in this story world, it basically eats up your mental faculties. It takes all these mental resources in order to create that story world. In this case, a very beautiful castle with a lovely pond and a rainbow. But whatever it might be that you're absorbed in, that requires a lot of cognitive resources, which reduces your capacity to intercept, react to, and argue against the messages, the information that's coming through in that narrative, which you may well do if it were presented in a non-narrative format. So basically, stories allow messages and values to fly underneath the radar, if you will. Another aspect of this pathway, interactions with identity. These can be in all sorts of forms. For example, it might be social comparisons. When we read a story, read a book, we might compare ourselves with the person in that book. For example, Mark Boyle, his biography about a life without technology, we might compare ourselves to him, the character, this person in the story, in the same way that we do with friends, family, and other people in society. And in that way, we construct our own identity. We might decide, I want to adopt some of those behaviours or traits, or I don't identify with this at all, and I don't want to be like that person. Social learning. We can learn from others. Social learning is a huge part of what it is to be human. We've seen the example set from others in recent history and how many can follow. And parasocial relationships, which is a fascinating one. It's this notion of having almost a friendship with someone you've never met, but you might feel like you know very well. And I'm sure many people watching this and in the environment sector have that sort of relationship with someone like David Attenborough. And so what he believes, what he does, and what he thinks is right may affect us a heck of a lot more than the average person or the average character in a story. And importantly, this notion of identification, which is in itself a form of Diectic Shift. It's when we as audience members experience reception and interpretation of the text, say a book or film, from the inside as if events are happening to us. So we actually take on the identity of characters. We're no longer spectators. So for example, we might take on the identity of a woman in Iceland trying to bring down the fossil fuel industry or mining companies. And if we identify with her throughout that film, the question is what comes from that? Do we adopt certain traits at the other end of that story? Empathy is another mechanism important to identity. We need to identify with someone or something on some level in order to empathize with them. And anthropomorphization here probably shown in one of its more artistic forms, the film Cats. Anthropomorphization, ascribing human traits or what we perceive to be human traits to non-humans. How does this influence our ability to identify, to empathize with those subjects? And then meaningful media experiences. Questions around what Aristotle referred to as eudaimonia, this idea of deep connections. If we think about many media experiences, the reason we watch many films, listen to many songs, it could be for what might be termed hedonic motivations, to feel good. Eudaimonic media, we often seek out quite sad, quite pensive content to give us this eudaimonic feeling, this deeper feeling of connection with the world and understanding of ourselves. And so that's one form of meaningful media experiences. And then there are things like self-transcendent media experiences. Can you provide experiences through media, through film, through story, that take people out of themselves? If you've ever stood on top of a mountain and looked out across the landscape, you might have felt awe. You might have had this moment that you can't quite describe where you just felt something very profound. And these feelings are often referred to as self-transcendent experiences. And there's now interest in how these can be afforded through media. And what is the outcome of that? If we provide people self-transcendent media experiences with regards to nature, and nature is certainly a strong source for such things, what is the outcome of that? All of these are still questions, because as I said, very little, if any, of this research has been done with regards to the environmental space, although it has been dabbled in health and in other areas. So this is a massive interest to me personally from my PhD perspective, but also of huge interest to us at Remember the Wild. And that's because we tell these stories, as I said, and increasingly we're trying to work more and more with ecologists and conservationists to tell stories that actually have some kind of tangible outcome and that we're able to understand how those outcomes are achieved. the broad model that we use for this is that we have a campaign, or we develop a campaign with groups that we might be working with. And that campaign involves, of course, a story, and that story might be in the format of a film, it might be in the format of podcasts or storytelling events. And then we have audience behaviours that we want to be motivated by this story. And that could be donations, that could be to volunteer for the cause, it could be stop taking your dog on the beach because there are birds nesting here. It could be an actual conservation behaviour. And of course, then there's outcomes that we're seeking. It could be organisational sustainability, particularly for small not-for-profit groups who are working on important subjects, but aren't necessarily making the big bucks for saving a species of bird or a species of mammal. It could be that it provides enough awareness or political will or profile for these groups that they are seated at the table for important decisions. Or it could be, and ultimately we hope would be, conservation outcomes for the species and ecosystems in question. And so just a few examples of how we're doing this at the moment. We're in post-production now for a feature documentary film on the Plains Wanderer, which is found in the north of Victoria, sometimes in parts of South Australia and New South Wales, occasionally Queensland. A pretty amazing bird and very, very endangered. The model we're working with here is to create this film with our partners to have targeted film screenings involving the landowners in question and broader film screenings to have a fundraising campaign with those funds going directly to the protection of the species. So here, using story to influence knowledge, attitudes, and that connection with grasslands, temperate grasslands, and this species of bird with a pro-environmental behaviour outcome in fundraising and then conservation outcome after that. And a similar model we're working with the National Manufas Recovery team. Again, a documentary film with film screenings, a fundraising campaign, as well as volunteer recruitment. In that situation, very much about trying to create a support network that would donate and resource the Manufas Recovery team and the Victorian Manufas Recovery group and allow them to do this work in perpetuity. They rely on grants, they rely on the occasional government funding. Here is an effort to try and give them another source of revenue so that they can continue to do the work that they need to do and ensure the conservation outcomes for this bird. And this bird, obviously not shy from the camera, after days of setting up hides around other malleefowl mounds that didn't want anything to do with me, this bird decided I could walk straight up to it. So that was great. There's a lot of hides out there that don't necessarily need to be there, but it was a learning experience. And then we have an initiative or a program called Community Conservationists, which is where we work with smaller groups who are under-resourced and we believe are working on important issues, a variety of issues. And we source outside funding from grants, for example, to allow us to train them in engagement and communications. We provide them with a long-term engagement strategy that will achieve the goals that they're interested in. And then we create a short film to complement that engagement strategy, and particularly to help achieve some tangible short to medium term goals. So currently this year, we're working with the Friends of Helmeted Honeyeater. This is the 50-year anniversary of the helmeted honeyeater being labelled our state bird emblem. We're working with my community, Applied Mycology citizen science group, trying to understand fungi, recruit more citizen scientists, and use eDNA and other forms of analysis to understand what fungi are in our ecosystems. And the Cardinia Environment Coalition, who do a whole range of things. They're basically a huge network of different land care groups that have come together to look after the Cardinia Shire and helping them as well. So that's some of the work that we do. If you're interested, please do check out our website, rememberthewild.org.au. You can follow us on social media. A lot of the stories that we produce are for public consumption as well. So thanks to my team at Remember the Wild and also to the University of Melbourne who are involved in our research. Thanks.
Chris, thank you. Thank you so much. Woo, you can hear people applauding all over the place, I'm sure. Fabulous. You know, that really helps us understand why our brain's privileged story and why story can be so compelling and so impactful and how we can use it for good. So thank you, that's terrific. And it was great to hear about the Plains Wanderer film as well. I think it's going to be screened in our Nature Festival that's coming up in September, October as well. So it's another thing to look out for, which will be great. So thank you so much. That was terrific. I really appreciate that. It was a great story about story. Really enjoyed it. I'm just, my Q&A thing is going around in a little circle and not letting me read it. But Andy, I think we've certainly got a couple of questions now for Maddi, and we probably also have some for Chris. Can you help lead us through a couple of questions?
No worries at all. Yeah, we've definitely got one for Maddi. So this one is from Brad, and he's asking about the current thinking regarding cultural practices and land management in Southeast Australia has placed a great deal of importance on cultural burning. And he's just wondering if there's cultural values and practices that could also be incorporated in land management more broadly. So expanding from just cultural burning to other things that we're not aware of.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Brad. That's a really great question. And I think that definitely it's really great that there's an emphasis on cultural burning at the moment, but cultural practices extend, that's just one element of cultural practice. And I think there's many other opportunities. And I think a lot of them is where that sort of bringing together two ways of knowing, or bringing together Western practice and Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous practice together is really important. I'm thinking about things like access to food and the way in we produce food at the moment and the way in which we use resources, thinking back to that photo at the Darling Barker and the way in which we use resources such as water at the moment in ways that are unsustainable. How can we maybe look at more localized food and resource sustainability? How can we recycle what we already have? And then how does that practice care for country and nourish country? Because not only does Indigenous practice, we have to extract from country to be able to survive, but the point is that we give back to country in some way, and that cultural burning is one of those ways. But I think that embedding that is really important. And I think that to me is where that two ways of knowing can bring together, outcomes for everybody.
Thank you so much, Maddi. That was really insightful, and thank you for responding to that question. We have another one for you from Di, and she's asking if you found any artifacts at Pentridge when you did that work.
Yes, I was actually excavating in that photo one of the old cells at Pentridge. We found really great artifacts that had been stashed in the floorboards, big rubbish pits with, pannikins from the 1870s. I think Pentridge is a really interesting place. It sits, and it's hard to picture it now, but it sits so high on the landscape, and it would have had a dominating presence over Melbourne. But if you think about that, it would have also been an important viewpoint for Aboriginal, for Wurundjeri people in particular, as a place to hunt. And before it was a prison, it was a stockade, and it was manned by the native police. And so it's got this really interesting history and really sad history. But a lot of those personal items we uncovered in our excavation, as well as the sort of ruins of the panopticons, which were these exercise yards that the prisoners would have an hour a day, and they wouldn't be able to see anybody else, and they were watched all the time. And so it's a really sad place, but I think you know, has these really fascinating layers of history, and you can go and watch a movie and have an ice cream there now. So it's a fascinating place.
I'm glad you found some cool stuff. It's a good story there too. I've got a question for Chris now, and Brad's asking, what do you think the best ways are for researchers to tell interesting stories while sustaining the importance of scientific evidence that supports the narrative? So is it video or audio or written or presentations? Do you have any thoughts on that, Chris?
Yeah, look, I mean, so there's two parts to that question, I guess. What is the best way of telling story, but what is the best way of telling story that sustains the scientific evidence? I think the evidence component can be sustained in any format, so long as, you know, you're making that a priority. Probably I'd say the answer really depends on who your audience is. If you're trying to speak to a specific audience, you know, if you're trying to talk to people who subscribe to listen to environmental talks, then this is a great format to do that, obviously. If you're trying to talk to a broader audience, you might use certain, you know, channels such as ABC Radio. If you're trying to capture other attention, you might use social media. I think in any digital format, video tends to be king, short format video. But it's all context dependent.
Thanks so much, Chris. And I might answer this one for you. I think, if I'm correct, the Plains Wanderer documentary isn't out yet. Is that correct?
It's not out yet. We are waiting to hear back about the Melbourne International Film Festival as a potential premiere for it. And following that, the Environmental Film Festival Australia, so EFA. So we will know more about the release dates then, but it will be out this year.
Awesome. And while I have your microphone and camera on, there's another question that's asking about narrative and can it be viewed as a thread to which stories are attached?
It can be viewed that way. The word narrative and the word story can be viewed just about any way you like. From what I can tell, there's many different definitions. Some people use story to refer to the structure of a story and narrative to refer to the general concept of a story, which is a very confusing sentence. I personally prefer to think of storytelling in a very broad sense and narrative as a more structured form of storytelling. For example, some people talk about narrativity, the degree of narrativity of a story increases the more you have identifiable characters, the more you have conventional things like a beginning and a middle and an end, the more you have these other conventional, at least from a Western perspective, storied elements. That makes it more of a narrative. Whereas a story could be just about anything. There's lots of stories. Gossip is a story. And whether it's a particularly strong narrative that gossip is provided in, I would still say it's a story.
Thank you so much, Chris. Maddi, we're going to finish probably on this last question for you, and it's around, I guess, being appropriate in the way we refer to stories about traditional owners and Aboriginal people. A question from Colin is about, as an Anglo-Australian, when storytelling to talk about the Wurundjeri as our people, is that considered something that might be offensive? Do you have any advice on how we can best be inclusive in the way we tell stories that involve Aboriginal people?
Yeah, I mean, context is king. I think that I don't like being referred to as our Indigenous people because it sort of often dismisses Aboriginal people's sovereignty. As an Indigenous person, I often say us or we to talk about solidarity, but I would never claim Wurundjeri stories as my own. So I think it's all around context. If we're talking about a community that you belong to, then that's fine to talk about it in communal terms. But if it's a possessive term, I think that can be offensive. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Paddy. Fern, I might throw it back to you to close off today and thank everyone for attending today.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks to people who asked questions, and huge thanks to Maddi and Chris for sharing stories, sharing insights, and just, I hope, widening our perspectives today. You know, a lot of the research that we hear about in our ARI seminars is strictly ecological, but I think it's clear that to support nature into the future and to help people into the future as well, these things are intertwined in ways that can't really be separated, and it's really important that we consider and integrate this thinking into our research practice. So thank you so much. I'm really grateful to hear from you today, and we look forward to hearing more from you as you get more stories out in the world. So thank you so much. Thanks to everybody who attended today. The recording will be available on the ARI website in a little while, and as are the recordings from our other seminars. And we've got another one coming up soon. Andy, what's
2 weeks, Fern. World Environment Day.
Yes, Ashley Sparrow talking about make nature great again, basically. It's World Environment Day. The theme is restoration. Ashley has got something fascinating coming up, and I look forward to that too. So thanks, everybody. Thanks so much for jumping on. Catch you next time. Bye.